The streets of Kenya were a storm waiting to break, and when it did, it wasn't the roar of bullets but the silence of resistance that echoed louder than anything. For decades, Kenyan riot police were the unbending enforcers of government orders, trained to respond to unrest with force, to crush dissent before it grew into disruption. But then came a day that broke all patterns, shattered expectations, and whispered of a new future. As protests surged across Nairobi, Kisumu, and Mombasa, fueled by unbearable fuel prices, skyrocketing food costs, and the chilling death of activist Albert Owang in police custody, the country stood on a razor's edge. And then, the order came. Not a suggestion, not a warning, but a command: shoot to incapacitate. Aim for the legs. Silence the crowd. Control the chaos. But instead of raising their rifles, the riot police looked at each other, and lowered them. A viral video surfaced, raw and shaky, but unmistakably real. A voice crackled through the tension: "We will not shoot our people." In a flash, the chants of anger turned to gasps, then applause. It was not just an act of defiance, it was a moment of clarity in a system long clouded by fear. Kenya had seen its share of police violence before, from post-election crackdowns to extrajudicial killings in slums. But this time, the guns stayed silent, and that silence became a louder cry than any protest chant. The government scrambled, denying the existence of such an order, claiming the footage was out of context, but the damage, or perhaps the healing, had already begun. Human rights groups confirmed similar reports from multiple cities. The refusal was not isolated. It was spreading. Officers were questioning the morality of commands, the legality, the cost to their own souls. The choice to disobey wasn't made lightly, it meant risking careers, reputations, maybe even prison. But they chose to stand with their people, not against them. And in the background of every online discussion, one name echoed: Ibrahim Traoré. The young leader of Burkina Faso, the soldier who rose to power not with threats but with a promise, never to spill the blood of his people to stay in control. That pledge had turned him into a continental symbol of a new kind of leadership, one rooted in dignity, not dominance. His words spread like wildfire through African youth forums, activist pages, and quietly, through the minds of officers who once felt they had no choice but to obey. Could it be that Traoré's philosophy had reached the ears of Kenyan police? Had his stance given courage to those who, for once, wanted to protect rather than punish? No one can say for certain. But something had changed. This was no longer just a protest. It was a pivot. A fracture in a system long ruled by fear. And in that crack, light poured in. The refusal marked not just a refusal to shoot but a refusal to remain tools of oppression. Kenya's police had spoken, not in words, but in silence. And the world listened. The moment the riot police refused to fire was not a fluke, not a single crack in an otherwise solid wall. It was the beginning of a fracture that revealed the rotting foundation beneath Kenya's policing culture. This was not just about one protest or one controversial order. It was the eruption of decades of buried tensions, hidden debates, silent shame, and suppressed conscience. The order had been clear and cold: use live ammunition against demonstrators damaging property, shoot at their legs to send a message, restore fear where rage had taken root. But this wasn't a faceless crowd anymore. These weren't just statistics or enemies of the state. These were their neighbors, their classmates, their own brothers and sisters. The officers, especially the younger ones, many of whom had joined the force believing in promises of reform and dignity, found themselves standing at a crossroads. They knew what compliance looked like. They had seen the aftermath before. They had cleaned the blood, heard the cries, lived with the guilt. But this time, something had shifted. Behind closed doors and anonymous interviews, officers described the order as a slap in the face to everything they were trained to uphold: justice, service, the protection of life. Legal experts quickly entered the conversation, reminding everyone that under both Kenyan law and international human rights agreements, lethal force is only justified when there's an immediate threat to life. Property damage is not a death sentence. Vandalism is not war. The Kenya National Commission on Human Rights issued a public warning: if officers followed this order, they wouldn't be able to hide behind the chain of command. They could be held criminally responsible. That was a game changer. For the first time, the state's blunt demand clashed with personal accountability. Every officer now had to ask themselves, was obedience worth the risk of becoming a national villain, an international headline, or a defendant in a courtroom? And the answer, for many, was no. It wasn't just about fear. It was about identity. The police had spent years trying to clean their image, shifting toward community-based strategies, de-escalation training, and public trust initiatives. This new order felt like betrayal from the top, dragging them backward into an era of brute force they had tried to leave behind. Even senior officials in the command structure reportedly balked at the implications. Internal debates leaked to the press revealed confusion, hesitation, even quiet resistance among commanders. There was one truth that nobody could ignore: this wasn't 1990. This was the age of smartphones, live streams, global hashtags, and viral justice. One misstep could be broadcast worldwide in seconds. And the officers on the ground knew that once the trigger was pulled, there would be no taking it back. Their faces would be plastered on screens. Their names would be dissected in headlines. And their legacies would be forever stained. That's why when the order came, so many refused. Not out of cowardice, but out of courage. Out of clarity. Out of a belief that doing what's right may cost you your badge, but saves your soul. And in the midst of this reckoning, the words of Ibrahim Traoré began to feel less like an echo and more like a guidepost. His leadership wasn't built on fear. It was built on respect. He didn't demand loyalty through violence, he earned it through integrity. And that idea, radical as it sounds in the corridors of African power, had begun to take root in the very heart of Kenya's police force. The refusal wasn't just disobedience. It was the birth cry of a new mindset, one where the people wearing uniforms see themselves not as shields for the regime, but as guardians of justice. And that mindset, once awakened, does not sleep again. What happened next was more than symbolic. It was a rupture that sent tremors through every layer of Kenyan governance. The refusal by riot police to shoot wasn't just a decision on the street, it was a defiance that echoed into the halls of power, where lawmakers and security chiefs scrambled to contain the fallout. Within hours, government spokespeople attempted to spin the narrative, denying that any such shoot-to-kill order had ever been issued, claiming videos were manipulated, and accusing foreign media of fanning the flames. But the people weren't buying it. The footage was too clear. The witnesses too many. Human rights groups had already corroborated the claims. Protesters held placards that didn't just call for justice, they referenced Burkina Faso by name, calling it a beacon, and Traoré a light in the dark. Social media exploded with hashtags like #Traoré Effect and #ProtectNotPunish. It wasn't just a local rebellion anymore. It was becoming a movement, a philosophy, a shared continental awakening. And that terrified those in charge. Because for decades, political leaders across Africa had relied on one unshakable pillar: police and military obedience. That pillar had just cracked. And it cracked not because someone fired a weapon, but because someone didn't. Protesters, once bracing for rubber bullets and tear gas, now found themselves facing officers who looked them in the eye with hesitation, even empathy. Some protesters wept. Some reached out their hands. And for the first time in years, hands weren't slapped away, they were held. The tension that had defined decades of public demonstrations suddenly softened. A new question filled the air: what if the police aren't the enemy? What if they too are tired, betrayed, and angry? In Nairobi, reports surfaced of small groups of protesters and officers sitting side by side, talking quietly, exchanging stories. Not as foes, but as people. This was unprecedented. And it threatened to rewrite the rules of protest, power, and control. The state responded with mixed signals. Some high-ranking officials warned of disciplinary action, hinting at purges within the police ranks, citing national security and chain of command discipline. But others, civil society leaders, legal scholars, and even a few brave lawmakers, called for restraint. They argued that what happened wasn't mutiny. It was progress. It was the first step toward transforming a system built on fear into one guided by responsibility. Reform commissions that had long been ignored suddenly found themselves quoted in headlines. Policy drafts on police accountability, once collecting dust, were now being dusted off. Donor agencies called for an investigation, not to punish officers, but to understand how such a refusal could become a foundation for future policing. And through it all, one truth remained unshakable: this movement wasn't about one country. It was about many. From Nigeria to Ghana, from South Africa to Uganda, online forums lit up with officers and citizens alike discussing what happened in Kenya. They weren't just watching, they were learning. Asking. Hoping. Could we do the same? Would our police choose conscience over command? Would our streets echo with courage instead of gunfire? And in every thread, in every discussion, the name Ibrahim Traoré returned. Not as a savior, but as a symbol. A reminder that leadership doesn't have to come with bloodshed, that power doesn't require violence. His refusal to harm his people had turned into a viral mantra. And now, in the hands of Kenyan officers, it was transforming into action. The silence of the guns wasn't the end of the battle. It was the beginning of something deeper, a war of ideas, ethics, and identity. And as this new war spread, it became clear, Africa was listening. And perhaps, for the first time in a long time, the people in uniform were too. What began as a refusal to obey a single command had now become a mirror, forcing Kenya to confront the kind of nation it truly wanted to be. No longer could political leaders pretend this was just a miscommunication or a one-time insubordination. The refusal had carved a fault line through the very foundation of Kenya's relationship between the people and those sworn to protect them. And on either side of that fault line stood two visions for the future, one clinging to the old order of dominance and fear, the other reaching toward dignity and reform. For ordinary Kenyans who had long faced police brutality as an unchangeable reality, this moment felt surreal. People who had once run from the sound of boots now stood tall, sensing a shift not just in power but in possibility. Protesters spoke with new confidence. Activists began organizing with new hope. And within the police force itself, whispers of solidarity began to grow louder. Younger officers who had once buried their doubts under layers of survival began to speak to each other more openly. What if this was the beginning of something bigger? What if they could actually be the protectors they were trained to be? What if they could wear the uniform with pride instead of shame? But that transformation wasn't guaranteed. Within the government, voices rose in warning. Some warned of chaos if police officers started picking and choosing which orders to follow. Others accused foreign influencers and digital media of poisoning the minds of Kenya's youth. Secret meetings were held. Crackdowns on dissenting officers were quietly proposed. There were talks of reshuffling command structures, reasserting control, and restoring the chain of obedience. But even as these conversations took place behind closed doors, a new kind of conversation was unfolding in the open. Human rights organizations launched urgent campaigns to protect whistleblowers within the police. Legal scholars published articles defending the right of refusal in cases where orders violate human rights. University students organized forums, naming their events after Traoré's famous quote, "We will not shed the blood of our people." Suddenly, ethics was trending. Morality was news. And through every headline and hashtag, the image of a police officer laying down his rifle stood as a quiet revolution. The line between state and citizen had begun to blur. No longer were police seen as faceless enforcers. They were becoming symbols of resistance, of redemption, of reconciliation. And yet, with every step forward came the looming threat of backlash. History has shown time and again that institutions built on fear do not yield easily. For every officer who chooses conscience, there may be 10 more bound by ambition, loyalty, or fear of losing their position. For every leader who sees hope and reform, there are others who see only risk. And so the struggle intensified. Behind the viral videos and heartwarming protests was a quiet war of documents, laws, promotions, and punishments. Would those who said no to violence be silenced? Or elevated as heroes? Would Kenya embrace this turning point, or suppress it before it spread? Meanwhile, the world was watching. International observers praised the moment as a rare glimpse of democratic maturity. But they too knew the fragility of such moments. In other countries, similar sparks had been snuffed out before they became fires. But Kenya was different. The refusal had been seen, shared, and immortalized. It had entered the culture. It had shaped the language. And most of all, it had broken the myth that change must come from the top. Because in Kenya, change had come from the ground. From the street. From the quiet decision of an officer who, in a moment of truth, looked at his people, looked at his gun, and chose not to pull the trigger. That single act may have saved a life. But its echo? It might just save a nation. Across Kenya and far beyond its borders, a question now lingers in the minds of millions. Was this just a moment, or was it the beginning of a movement? The refusal of the riot police to obey a violent order has already shifted the national conversation, but something deeper is taking shape, something harder to measure yet impossible to ignore. Across the continent, officers in cities thousands of miles away are discussing the incident in closed forums, in locker rooms, over late-night calls and encrypted chats. From Nigeria to South Africa, from Senegal to Ethiopia, the phrase keeps returning, if they can do it, why can't we? This is not the language of revolutionaries, it is the quiet murmur of conscience spreading through an institution long trained to suppress it. The impact of this refusal cannot be confined to policy changes or disciplinary reviews. It's something more fundamental, a crack in the armor of authoritarian tradition that has defined African policing for generations. That tradition, inherited from colonial forces designed to dominate rather than serve, has long viewed public dissent as an enemy, not an expression. But that idea is being challenged, not by politicians, not by think tanks, but by those inside the system itself. For years, young recruits joined the force with hope in their hearts, only to have it worn down by corruption, brutality, and fear. Now, they're seeing another path, one shaped not by obedience, but by values. And central to that shift stands the figure of Ibrahim Traoré. His words, his restraint, his refusal to shed the blood of his citizens have become more than a political statement. They are a template, a possibility, a counter-narrative to the lie that violence is the only language of power. His example has shown that leadership can mean protection, not punishment. And when that idea reached Kenya's streets, it found fertile ground. But the path ahead is not guaranteed. Those who benefit from control will not relinquish it easily. Governments may attempt to tighten their grip, introduce harsher penalties for disobedience, create elite units loyal only to the ruling class. They may brand acts of conscience as betrayal, spread propaganda to undermine officers who refuse violent orders, and drown out ethical voices with noise and fear. But they cannot unsee what has been seen. They cannot unhear the silence of the rifles. They cannot erase the image of police standing shoulder to shoulder with the people they once feared. That image is now part of history. It is a reference point for future generations who will ask not whether change is possible, but how it began. And when they search for the answer, they will find it not in the offices of power, but in the streets of Nairobi, in the hesitant hands of an officer who lowered his weapon, in the chant of citizens who applauded courage instead of fearing command. This is how change begins. Not with declarations, but with decisions. Not with riots, but with refusals. Not with the loudest voice, but with the quietest truth. The Kenyan police may not have set out to change Africa's future. But their choice became a seed. And from that seed, something new is growing. A belief that ethics can survive even in the hardest institutions. That integrity can echo louder than orders. And that someday soon, the line between people and power won't be drawn in blood, but in trust. Across the continent, the eyes of a generation are watching. And in that gaze lies the most powerful force of all, hope. Hope that one day, across every nation, in every uniform, in every command, conscience will no longer be the exception. It will be the rule. Because when power listens to the people instead of silencing them, when leaders protect rather than punish, when officers say no not out of rebellion but out of responsibility, then history changes. And in Kenya, that change has already begun.